One sweater, 553 different yarns. Let's talk about it. Hey everyone, Andrea here. Welcome to Karchermakes, and today we are talking about my knitting magnum opus, my dream project, the perfect project for all of those scraps, leftovers, advents, mini skeins, the End Times Cardigan by Amy Young Gunderson. So I really wanted to make a dedicated video just for this project because it is my love letter to the indie dyed yarn community. All the hard work and love that they put into these colorways really is celebrated in this pattern by Amy, and I love it. So first, let's really talk about the pattern and the choices that I made and the journey on how I got to 553 different colors. So first up, I cast this on January 1st, 2024 and finished it December 14th, 2024. So nearly a year went into this sweater. There were times that I wanted to give up. There were times that I could not put it down, but ultimately I love it. I'm so glad I stuck with it, and it's fabulous. So like I mentioned, this is a pattern by Amy Young Gunderson. It is a paid pattern. It is $8 on Ravelry, and the pattern comes with several size ranges. It goes up to, I want to say, a 5 or 6X. So in addition to it having a broad size range, it's also very customizable. So when you download the pattern, and there's actually two parts to this pattern, and we'll talk a little bit about that second part in a minute, but when you download the pattern, it includes not only the layout of the squares, so there's 4 different techniques or ways to create the squares, and they're numbered 1 through 4. Depending on where in the pattern you are picking up, you create a different numbered square. So like number 1 would be here, number 2, number 3, number 4. That's just the example. I don't recall exactly. But there's a schematic for the square layout, numbers 1 through 4. So in addition to a broad size range, this pattern is also highly customizable. So when I swatched for this pattern, and I never swatch, but I swatched for this one, I found that my gauge was tighter than what the pattern called for. And this is not unusual for me. That is almost always the case. I tend to be a very tight knitter, although over time I have loosened up a little bit, but whenever I do swatch, in the rare event that I swatch, I find that I am tighter than what the gauge calls for. So how I kind of compensated for that is I went through the schematics that are included in the pattern with the measurements, and it gives all the measurements for like the sleeve length, the length of the front, the width of the back, the drop of the sleeve, all of that. So taking into account my tighter gauge, I ended up going with a size larger. So I did make the size large, and I feel like I got the fit that I wanted to get out of it. Now, I did also swatch on size US 5 needles, as well as I swatched on US 7 needles with holding the yarn double to basically get a DK weight. And although I did like those fabrics, I liked the US 2 kind of tighter fabric better, and I feel like it worked well. So all that to say, I didn't really make any adjustments to the pattern itself. I followed it basically verbatim for everything, including the color layout. So These are effectively half square triangles, and the technique that it uses is intarsia, and don't be scared. It's like, I was so worried about intarsia and managing the different yarns, but because the squares are so small, it's really inconsequential at that point. Like, these squares are maybe 1.5 inches wide and tall. So you're working with very tiny amounts of yarn at any given point. So it's not like a large intarsia project where you're managing all the bobbins. You're only working with 2 colors at one time. Now, you can very easily modify this pattern in a million different ways, the color layouts being one. So if you look up half square triangles for quilts, you will see there's so many different ways you could lay these colors out, and how you could basically change how the design looks. Like, you could make these into stars, you could make them into just bigger sort of colored triangles by changing the way in which you lay out the colors. So in terms of flexibility with this project, I really feel like it lends itself to a lot of customization. So like I mentioned, I followed the pattern pretty much verbatim, and maybe one thing that I would change is making this border strip a little wider. So it called for, I believe it was 10 or 12 rows once you pick up the edges, 10 or 12 rows of, I believe this is 1x1 rib. Maybe hindsight's 2020 as always. Maybe I would have done this a little wider, and if I ever make this again, I would make this slightly wider, just because at the way it fits, it doesn't really kind of come together in the middle for me. So the way this pattern is written, it calls for these shorter sleeves, and I like that it gives that kind of flexibility. You could very much have stopped the sleeve length, like say here, and made it a drop shoulder style, and then picked up at that point and then knit just a regular like long sleeve version of this. I feel like that would be a nice modification. And then in addition with the neckline, so it's just a regular 1x1 pickup, 1x1 ribbed neckline that you pick up and knit. I feel like you could very much have done a shawl type collar on this. It's very easily modifiable to that. Let's talk about the yarns that I used, and I'm not even going to begin to try to name every dyer that I used in this, but there's 553 different yarns here, and I used various advents, various mini skein sets, leftovers, scraps of scraps that have been in 2, 3, 4, 5 other projects. I have used all of these yarns, and I'll insert some footage of the leftovers from this project, which are living in a giant bin, and now I have to select another scrappy project to use all of these leftovers with. So maybe 2025 is going to include another giant scrappy project with 500 yarns in it. So one thing I want to start doing, especially for bigger projects like this, is a sort of report card review of the project, the pattern, and include some different criteria within that rating or scoring. So for this one, let's start with the pattern. We'll start with the pattern first. So in terms of the kind of clarity or legibility of the pattern itself, we're going to start there. So first off, this pattern really was kind of 2-in-1. So there was the pattern itself for, the design of the sweater, but then also there was an accompanying PDF that was basically the tutorial on how to create these squares using the intarsia technique. And for somebody like me who has never done intarsia before this project, I found that to be supremely helpful. The pattern also included instructions on how to manage the ends of the yarns so that you don't really have to weave them in at the end. It includes all the details on how to manage that, and then you're really left with nothing to weave in. Now, all that to say, I'm paranoid, so I did take the time to kind of loop them back through a couple stitches, but for the most part, there's no weaving in ends on this project whatsoever. That is not required. So for pattern legibility and clarity, I give it an A. So let's talk about the formatting. So this pattern did include a stitch glossary, which, you know, you kind of take for granted that most patterns should do that, but in my experience, that doesn't always happen. And again, like I mentioned, because this included a technique that I was not familiar with, I really appreciated the fact that it had a stitch glossary included. So I also mentioned the schematics. So there were 2 different schematics included for every single size. One was the block layout. So like I mentioned, the blocks are numbered 1 through 4 depending upon where they're at in the row and how you have to do the pickups. And then also it included schematics that had the actual finished measurements of each piece of the cardigan so that once you block it out, you have the correct measurements to block it to. And then my last little kind of nitpicky thing that I like to rate patterns on is the actual sort of formatting of the written pattern itself. And this gets an A because there were no weird fonts, there were no weird background colors. The accompanying tutorial had color pictures for each piece of that process, and I really appreciated that as well. So in terms of sizing, like I mentioned, this does go up to a size 6X, which is a 76-inch bust. And then even from there, once you see kind of the block layout diagram, you can very easily modify it. You can add more blocks where you need them to be wider or longer. So for example, my sweater hits right at my hip. And if I wanted it to be longer, like for example, maybe I wanted a duster style, I could have very easily just added rows to that section of the diagram and then made the project longer. Same thing with the width. So this is kind of an open style cardigan, and although she does not give the instructions on there's no button band, there's no buttonholes to contend with, but if you wanted to modify this to include that, you could very easily do so. And then you could also add another row of squares here if you wanted it to be a more sort of closed fitted cardigan. So in terms of sizing and flexibility, I would also give this pattern an A. Additionally, if you wanted to do a crocheted pickup instead of the knitted 1x1 rib pickup, you could absolutely do that as well. So now let's talk about the report card for the project itself. So we talked about the pattern, now let's talk about this project. So first off is fit, and I feel like that's really the most important thing to grade about a project, especially a garment, is the fit. And I would give this a B+. And the only reason why I'm saying a B+ is because I would have liked the border here to be wider, which, like I mentioned, that's very easily modifiable. I just chose not to do it. And then also, like I mentioned, it's at a hip length, and maybe I would have preferred that to be a tiny bit longer. So two ways that we could kind of handle that modification. One would be, like I mentioned, to add another row of squares across the bottom, or I could have made the border wider there as well. So in terms of the aesthetic, I know this is not for everyone. I know that a super scrappy sweater made out of over 500 yarns is not everybody's jam, and that's okay, but it is my jam and I love it. I would give the aesthetic an A+. So overall, if we combine those two scores together, the overall score I would give this is absolutely an A. I think it is perfect for scraps, it's perfect for advents, mini skeins, countdowns, leftovers, you name it. Each one of these squares takes less than 1 gram of yarn per color. So the teeniest, tiniest little scraps that you have, the little ties that tie the hand-dyed yarn together, you could absolutely incorporate into this project. So now the $64,000 question. Would I make this again? The answer is maybe. And that maybe depends on a couple things. So first, do I want to take another year to make a sweater? And I don't know if I want to do that this year, but maybe in a future year coming up and I have a lot of time on my hands, I would do that. But if I were to make this again, I would make some of the modifications we talked about. First thing is I would make the squares bigger. Whether that means doing more stitches or using heavier weight yarn or fingering held double, I would absolutely make that choice. I would make the squares bigger so that there would be less of them. And then the second thing I would change is, again, like we talked about, is I would probably do the border a little wider and I would make the length of the sweater a little longer. So there we have it. It is the End Times cardigan. It is finished. It is amazing. I hope you enjoyed following along on this arduous journey that was this sweater. If you are a hand dyer and I've bought yarn from you, please know it's in here. So what are you planning to make this year with your scraps? Let's talk about it in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being here. I appreciate all the comments. I appreciate it if you subscribe. And until next time, happy making.